I was still sore from the stitches when he lit that cigarette right in front of me, the smoke curling toward my face like a slow insult. My chest tightened, and I felt that familiar burn in my lungs the doctor warned me about. I spoke softly, the way mothers do when they're trying not to start a fight. I said, "Could you please smoke outside?" The doctor said, "I need clean air while I heal." Before I could finish, my daughter snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet. She said, "Shut up, you're more annoying than the smoke." Then she shoved me back against the couch, and a sharp pain shot through my side where the stitches were still tender. I looked at her in disbelief, at the face I once kissed goodnight 1,000 times, and I couldn't recognize the person standing there. Her husband smirked, like it was entertainment, like watching me hurt was the highlight of his evening. I didn't say another word. I just sat there, breathing carefully, watching the smoke drift through the room, knowing that something inside me had just changed. 15 minutes later, that silence would turn into something they would never forget. Thank you for watching my story and for giving me a little bit of your time. Please tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It helps me feel like I am not sitting in this living room alone. My name is Caroline, and I live in a small town in Iowa, the kind of place where you see the same cars pass by every morning, and the cashier at the grocery store knows when you have been gone a few days. I worked hard all my life, raised my family in a modest house with a small yard and a tree that dropped too many leaves every fall. And I was never afraid of work or sacrifice. But this surgery changed things for me. It slowed me down. It reminded me that the body has limits, even when the heart still wants to keep going. The doctor sat me down before they discharged me and spoke very clearly. No smoke, no stairs, no stress. He said it more than once, and I nodded and promised I would listen, because I knew I wanted to heal and get back to cooking my own meals and folding my own laundry. My daughter said it would only be for a week, that staying with her would be easier than going straight back to my place. She said that they had space and that it would be nice to have me around. And I believed her. I wanted to believe those words. I packed my little overnight bag with my pain pills, my soft robe, and a blue folder with all my papers neatly tucked inside, the doctor's instructions, my home care schedule, and a few things my lawyer had helped me put together before I went in for surgery. Not because I expected trouble, but because life has taught me that it is better to be prepared quietly than to be surprised loudly. When I first arrived at their house, I tried to see only the good. The clean sheets they put on the couch, the glass of water on the side table, the extra pillow for my back. But even in those first hours I felt a kind of tightness in the air. Like I was a guest who needed to be careful not to take up too much space or breathe too loudly. I noticed the way their voices changed when they spoke to me, a little impatient, a little sharp around the edges, and I told myself it was just stress, that they were tired, that the mood would soften. And for a little while I pushed those thoughts aside and focused on counting my breaths and taking my medicine on time, not knowing that the moment with the cigarette and that shove would show me exactly where I stood in their eyes and would turn that quiet blue folder into something much more important than I ever imagined. The first full day there taught me more than any speech ever could. Because the house had a way of telling the truth when no one thought I was listening. The television stayed loud during my rest hours. Doors closed a little harder than they needed to. Cups were set down with a thud beside my pills, as if I were a task to complete, and small kindnesses arrived with a sigh that made them feel like debts instead of love. I noticed the ashtray drift closer to the living room, as if it belonged there. I noticed the window that could have been opened staying shut. And every time the oxygen machine hummed, I felt grateful for the steady air and guilty for needing it, which is a hard feeling to carry while you are trying to heal. I kept my blue folder in plain sight on the side table, not as a threat, but as a promise to myself that I would keep records. So I wrote down the time my medicine was delayed, the hour the smoke first reached my chair, the exact wording of the doctor's instructions that I read again and again when doubt crept in, and it steadied me the way a railing steadies a person on the stairs they are not supposed to climb. In the afternoon, I heard laughter from the kitchen, and my name said like a chore on a list, and a sentence floated out that stung more than the stitches. Something about how at least my pension made the groceries easier, and I stood very still by the doorway with my hand on the frame, because in that moment I understood I was not resting among caretakers, I was balancing among people who had already measured my usefulness. I did not shout, I did not plead, I simply sat back down, put the folder on my lap, and sent a polite message to confirm the next day's home care visit. Then I texted Mr. Allen and wrote the words we discussed before surgery. Please be available tomorrow afternoon. And after that, I set an alarm to breathe slowly every hour. Because I could not control their choices, but I could control my preparation. When evening came, I tried to make peace with the room by tidying my space, lining up my medications, placing a glass of water within easy reach, and folding my robe over the arm of the couch, the way I used to fold school uniforms in the old house. And I told myself that strength does not always arrive in loud gestures. Sometimes it arrives in quiet order, in clean lines, in papers ready to be opened when the moment asks for proof. Morning brought a thin light through the blinds, and I decided to move slowly and let the room show me who it was. I took my medicine with careful sips of water, eased the oxygen tube so it did not tug at the tender place, and smoothed the blanket across my knees the way I used to smooth a tablecloth before guests arrived. Because order helps me think, and I needed clear thoughts more than anything. I looked at the clock and at the small card the home care agency left with my schedule. The nurse and the social worker were assigned for the week after surgery, and I had confirmed the visit the night before, so I knew that help existed outside these walls, even if kindness felt thin inside them. I stood long enough to check the window latch and the distance between the ashtray and my chair, details that would matter if anyone asked questions later. Then I sat again and placed the blue folder where it could be seen without looking like a challenge, because I did not want a fight. I wanted the truth to stand up on its own legs. When the house stirred, I kept my voice gentle and asked for a little fresh air. Not a lecture, just the simple request that matched the doctor's words, and I watched the way it landed, not in the ear, but in the pride, and I understood that asking for clean air in a room like this was not a matter of comfort. It was a measure of respect. I felt the ache at my side and pressed my palm there. Not to hide the pain, but to remind myself that I had survived harder days than this. I had worked double shifts, buried loved ones, learned how to carry grief without making noise, and I could carry this too if I had to, but I did not have to carry it alone. I checked the time again, the steady sweep of the second hand, the quiet hum of the machine, and I told myself to breathe evenly, to let calm be my armor, to answer no cruelty with cruelty, and to let the facts do the talking when the moment arrived. I sent one last message that simply said, "I am at the address and available." Then I folded my phone case and set it beside the glass of water, and I felt a small strength rise in me. Not the kind that shouts and slams doors, the kind that waits, that trusts the doorbell, that trusts the paper, that trusts the hour you circled in ink on a quiet night when nobody believed you would need it. The house settled into a tight quiet after that burst of anger, the kind of quiet that makes you hear small things you would normally miss, the tiny click of the thermostat, the steady whisper of the oxygen, the second hand brushing past each mark on the clock. And I sat very still with my palm over the tender place, counting my breaths the way the nurse taught me at the hospital. In through the nose, out through the mouth, because calm was the only thing I could control in that moment. He took another drag, as if nothing had happened, flicked ash into the dish, and then they both drifted toward the door when a car pulled up outside. Voices rose on the porch, cheerful greetings that felt strange after what had just happened. And I watched the smoke thin in the air as the front door swung shut behind them. I did not follow. I did not call out. I straightened the papers inside my blue folder and set it on my lap. I lifted the glass and took a slow sip of water. And I told myself to let the minutes do their work, because time has a way of revealing what words cannot fix. I looked at the card with my appointment printed on it and laid it beside the remote so it would be easy to see. I slid my phone closer and opened the last message confirming the visit. And I felt a steady line of strength run through me, not pride and not stubbornness, just a quiet promise to my own body that I would keep it safe. Laughter floated in from outside like a television left on in the wrong room. And somewhere under that sound, I heard the memory of the doctor's voice telling me no smoke, no stairs, no stress. And I nodded without meaning to, as if I were back in that office, agreeing to follow the rules that would let me heal. The air was clearing. The room looked almost normal, but it was not normal at all. Because something inside me had settled into place. Not anger, not revenge. Just the decision to let help walk through the door when it knocked, to let truth stand where it could be seen, and to trust that the preparation I made on a quiet night would carry me through the next 15 minutes and into whatever came after. The doorbell rang with a gentle firmness that felt like a hand on my shoulder saying you are not alone. And I set the blue folder on my lap, drew one careful breath, and said, "Just a second," in a steady voice, as I eased myself up enough to see. Then, the door opened because it had not been locked when they stepped outside. And two people stood there with calm faces and badges at their collars. They said their names and where they were from, the nurse and the social worker assigned to my case after surgery. And I nodded and asked them to come in, because the air was still thin from the smoke and I did not want to stand any longer than I had to. They moved with quiet purpose. The nurse glanced at the oxygen machine and the ashtray, and the window that should have been cracked. The social worker sat on the edge of a chair and spoke in a calm tone that invited truth without fear. She asked if I felt safe here, and if anyone had touched me in a way that made my recovery harder. And I looked at her steady eyes and said yes. Then I told her what had just happened without adding heat to it. Just the words, the request for fresh air, the shove, the pain that shot through the stitches, the laughter on the porch as if none of it mattered. The nurse asked for permission to take a few photos for the record. The machine in its place, the ashtray beside it, the faint mark blooming on my arm where I caught myself against the couch, and I said yes. Because paper and pictures do not shout, they simply stand there and remember. And while she worked, she checked my pulse and my oxygen, and told me to keep breathing slowly, in through the nose and out through the mouth. And I followed her voice the way you follow a light down a hallway after a storm. The social worker opened her notebook and asked for my doctor's instructions. And I slid the blue folder toward her. She read the line that said no smoke, no stairs, no stress. And she read it out loud as if the room needed to hear it. Then, she asked about my support plan, and I told her about the neighbor who checks in and the lawyer who helped me organize my papers before the operation. Not because I expected trouble, but because I wanted to make it easy to do right by my body if anyone ever tried to make it hard. There was a pause then, a gentle kind of quiet that did not feel like the tight silence from before. It felt like a pause that makes room for the next good thing. And the nurse asked if I wanted the window opened and a glass of fresh water. And I said, yes, please. And when the air moved across the room, it felt like my chest could finally set something down. And I thought to myself that sometimes help does not arrive with noise. It arrives with a clipboard, a steady tone, and the simple question, are you safe? And when you answer honestly, the whole day changes direction without anyone raising their voice. When they finished their questions, the nurse stood to stretch and said she would step outside to call her supervisor. And the social worker stayed with me and asked if I wanted her to remain until they came back. I said yes, because her calmness felt like medicine in its own way. And while she sat quietly, she wrote notes in that small leather book she carried, her handwriting slow and deliberate as if each word carried weight. I told her that my daughter and her husband had gone out to meet someone, and she nodded, saying it was fine, that she wanted to be here when they returned so she could speak to them herself. And I felt both relief and sadness in that moment. Relief that I would not have to carry the explanation alone, and sadness that it had come to this. The nurse returned after a few minutes. The call finished, and she told me that her agency had already flagged the situation for immediate review because medical safety was part of her duty. She asked if I had somewhere else I would feel more comfortable staying. And I told her about my small house with the ramp already built, about my neighbor who kept an extra key and watered my plants. And she smiled and said, "We can make that happen sooner than you think." She helped me move the oxygen tubing so I could sit straighter and breathe easier, while they arranged a few things over the phone. And I listened to the rhythm of their voices blending softly in the background. Careful and respectful. Two professionals building a bridge back to safety, while still treating me like a person, and not a case number. I looked around that living room with its heavy curtains and its air that still carried the faint sting of tobacco. And I realized how strange it was that the same walls that once made me feel trapped were now witnessing my quiet rescue. Not because I screamed or begged, but because I spoke the truth and waited for the right ears to hear it. The social worker asked if I wanted to gather my personal items before they arrived again, and I nodded, pointing to the small bag by the chair, and she helped me zip it closed and place the blue folder neatly on top. I thanked them both. And the nurse said, "No need. You did the right thing by keeping records and by staying calm. That made it easy for us to see what was real." And hearing that softened something in me that had been tight since the shove, a knot of fear that finally began to loosen. I sat back in my chair, holding the glass of water she had refilled for me. And I felt the first genuine breath of peace I had taken in days, thinking how sometimes dignity does not roar or demand attention. It just waits for proof to arrive at the door, wearing a badge and a kind face. I heard their laughter before I saw them, the doors swinging open with that careless sound that fills a house before words even enter. And the moment they stepped inside, the nurse and the social worker both turned toward them with quiet authority, standing side by side, calm but firm, the kind of calm that makes even loud people lower their voices. My daughter froze when she saw the badges. Her husband's smirk slipped just a little, and for the first time since I arrived in that house, the air did not belong to them. It belonged to the truth. The nurse introduced herself again, polite and professional, and said she was there for my post-operative visit and medical assessment. She explained that during the check she had found the rooms smoky and unsafe for someone using oxygen, and that she had already taken photos to document the situation. My daughter tried to speak, words tumbling out about how it was just a misunderstanding, that they had stepped outside for a few minutes and everything was fine. But the social worker held up a hand gently and said she had heard enough to understand that this was not a single mistake. This was a pattern that needed to be addressed. The nurse asked if I had been pushed or harmed in any way, and I told her exactly what had happened, my voice steady though my heart beat loud in my chest. And as I spoke, my daughter's eyes widened, her mouth opening slightly like she couldn't decide whether to deny it or to cry. Her husband folded his arms, muttering that I was being dramatic, that it was just a little nudge. But the nurse turned to him with that steady, professional tone and said, "A patient with fresh stitches and oxygen equipment cannot be nudged, not without consequence." There was a silence after that, heavy but not cruel. Just the kind of silence that belongs to people realizing the weight of their own choices. The social worker began filling out a report, reading sections aloud so they could hear exactly what was being written, documenting every detail in clear language, and she explained that this report would be reviewed by their agency and forwarded to Adult Protective Services for follow-up, not as punishment but as procedure. My daughter's voice broke then. She said she didn't mean to hurt me, that it just happened in the heat of the moment, but her words came too late to erase the image of that shove or the sound of her laughter afterward. And I looked at her gently and said, "I believe you did not mean to hurt me. But meaning and action are two different things." The nurse helped me gather my bag and set it by the door. She told me that they had arranged transportation to a recovery facility where I would be more comfortable and properly cared for. And I thanked her quietly, because I knew my voice would tremble if I said more. My daughter stood motionless while the nurse spoke, her husband pacing behind her, both of them unsure whether to apologize or argue. And I realized that sometimes life doesn't need revenge or shouting, It just needs witnesses who write down what really happened. As the nurse opened the door to let in a fresh breeze, I felt a calmness settle over me, the kind that doesn't erase pain but replaces fear with certainty. And I thought to myself that 15 minutes ago I had been sitting in smoke, and now I was standing in clean air, breathing fully again. Not because the world changed, but because I finally allowed help to walk in. The car arrived not long after, its engine low and steady, and the nurse guided me carefully toward the door, while the social worker spoke quietly to my daughter about the paperwork she would receive. Each word measured, each sentence clear, and I could see the color drain from her face as she realized this was not a scene she could control with apologies or raised tones. I turned once before stepping outside, not to gloat or scold, but to look at the home where I had hoped to heal, and instead learned the true weight of silence. My daughter stood near the window, her arms wrapped around herself, and her husband stayed by the couch pretending to scroll his phone, both of them smaller somehow. Not because anyone had shamed them, but because truth has a way of shrinking pride until it fits inside the space it deserves. The nurse opened the car door and helped me settle in, adjusting the oxygen tubing so it wouldn't pull. And when I looked out through the glass, I saw the first thin line of sunlight breaking through the gray clouds, soft and golden, like a quiet promise that better air waited beyond their front gate. As the car pulled away, I closed my eyes, listening to the gentle hum of the road beneath me, and whispered to myself that sometimes the best kind of justice is leaving without raising your voice, because peace speaks louder than anger ever could. The ride to the recovery center felt longer than it was, the world passing in soft shapes beyond the window while my thoughts moved slower than the car itself. And for the first time in days, I let my shoulders fall, feeling the heaviness slip away bit by bit. When we arrived, the nurse led me into a quiet room with pale curtains and a vase of fresh flowers on the table, and I breathed in that clean scent of disinfectant and air free of smoke, the kind that makes you feel like you can start again. A different nurse helped me to bed, checked my oxygen, and brought me warm tea. And I thanked her with a small smile that came easier than I expected. I looked around and realized that this place, though temporary, carried the kind of peace that only truth can buy, because it was earned, not borrowed. The nurse who brought me in placed my blue folder on the table by my bed and said softly that everything was documented, every detail protected, and that I could rest now, and I nodded, feeling the quiet strength of knowing that my dignity had been written down in ink. That night, as the lights dimmed and the machine hummed steadily beside me, I whispered to myself that healing begins not when the pain ends, but when the noise does, and I drifted into sleep with nothing left to fear. Morning came gently at the recovery center, the sunlight touching the pale walls like it was reminding me that peace still existed somewhere. And I woke to the quiet rhythm of nurses moving through the hallway, their soft voices carrying the sound of care instead of command. My body still ached, but the pain felt different here. Manageable, lighter somehow, as if the air itself was helping me heal. After breakfast, the nurse helped me sit by the window, and I looked out at a small garden where a few patients walked slowly between the flowers, and I thought how healing does not need noise, it needs safety and truth. And both were finally mine. A doctor stopped by later, reviewed my file, and said that everything had been properly handled, that the agency had already opened an investigation into what happened, and I nodded, not with bitterness, but with quiet gratitude, because it meant no one could twist the story now. It was written and seen. When he left, I sat for a long time, tracing the rim of my teacup, feeling the warmth spread through my fingers. And I realized that sometimes victory does not come with celebration or applause. It comes with steady breathing, clean air, and the knowledge that you chose calm when chaos tried to claim you. I looked toward the blue folder on the bedside table, its edges neat, its purpose fulfilled, and I whispered to myself that this was what strength looked like. Not loud, not angry, but steady, quiet, and free. A few days later, a letter arrived with my daughter's handwriting on the envelope, the kind of handwriting I used to help her practice when she was young, careful and wide, now shaky at the edges as if written through tears. And for a long time I just looked at it without opening it, letting the weight of it rest in my lap like a memory that was not ready to be touched. When I finally opened it, the words were tangled between apology and confusion. She wrote that she was sorry, that she had lost her temper, that she did not realize how much she had hurt me, and she asked if there was any way to make things right. But even as I read those words, I could feel that they came from fear as much as remorse. Fear of what might follow. Fear of what had already been documented. Fear of what truth could no longer be undone. I folded the letter gently and placed it under the blue folder without answering. Because forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. It is not about erasing what happened. It is about protecting what remains. I decided that if we were ever to speak again, it would be in a calm place, with someone from the agency present, where apologies could meet accountability, and not just emotion, because love without respect is like a promise without action, and I had given enough of myself to words that changed with the wind. That evening I sat by the window again, watching the sun fade into the horizon, and I thought of all the things I taught her. Patience, gratitude, compassion, and how somewhere along the way she must have mistaken my gentleness for weakness. But I knew now that boundaries are not walls. They are doors that stay closed until trust knocks again. I took a slow breath, steady and full, and told myself that healing is not just for the body, it is for the heart that has been bruised too. And though I still loved her deeply, I loved my peace more. And this time I was not going to give it away so easily. Days passed and the quiet around me began to feel like a friend instead of a reminder of what was lost. I found comfort in the small routines of recovery. The gentle clink of cups at breakfast, the soft knock before a nurse entered, the kindness of people who had no reason to care but did anyway. Each evening, I would take my tea by the window and watch the light fade across the garden, thinking of how strange it is that sometimes peace does not arrive through forgiveness or reunion, but through distance that protects what little strength you have left. I learned that love without boundaries drains you, while peace rebuilds you piece by piece. And as I sat there breathing quietly, I realized that healing had finally found its way home to me. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. Your time means more than you know. Please tell me in the comments what you felt while listening, and don't forget to subscribe so we can share another moment together soon.